It's great to have such events in our country, and what other fitting place than Greece, which is the corridor across the three most populous continents to discuss about AI. And within this panel, we will be exploring mainly the other parts of the digital infrastructure around the data centers that enable this AI revolution. So within 2024, more than $500 million have been spent on data centers around AI. But although all the flashes have gone to the data centers, there's a big part of fabric and digital infrastructure that's there to enable that. We're talking about the fiber, the submarine cables, the peering locations and interconnection hubs, really the circulatory system that enables AI and brings it close to the end users. So every GPU cluster, every inference node, every data pipeline, all hinges on the fiber backbone. And we are at an inflection point. AI is changing the shape of demand, and fiber is there to enable that. So, great, looking forward to dive into that. I'm Miltos Andriopoulos, advisors within the strategy and M&A space, and I'm welcoming our distinct panelists. Should we have a round of introductions?
Thanks, Miltos, and thanks to the team also for setting up a great location, a great event. Toby Williams, I'm Chief Product Officer at euNetworks. We connect data centers with fiber. That's what we've been doing, riding on the back of cloud acceleration over the last decade. Really, I think, looking forward to the next decade where on top of that, overlaid is a further AI acceleration of that dynamic. We have something like 18 fiber-based metros across European capital cities and other larger cities, and connect about 55-odd cities with our long-haul network.
Amazing. Aditya, over to you.
Thanks. Well, firstly, lovely to be here. Thanks to the Tech Capital team for arranging this event. My name is Aditya Ayyagari. I am the CEO and co-founder of Quadrivium. We are an interconnection data center operator building global peering hubs around Europe. Fairly distinct strategy where we are building new submarine cable landing infrastructure. So creating a density of global connectivity points combined with interconnection data centers and with AI hubs, all part of the same campus. And the reason we're here in Greece and at this event in Athens is we're developing a global peering hub in Chania on the island of Crete, which is the easternmost location. You can be in the EU, you can peer under the EU regulatory umbrella and serve a vast population adjacent to the EU. Other locations that we're developing are Genoa in northern Italy and Lisbon, amongst other things.
Great. Nick?
Thank you. Hi, good morning. My name is Nick Barton. I'm the Chief Commercial Officer of AquaComms. So the clue's in our name, really. AquaComms is a subsea infrastructure owner and operator. We provide services predominantly across the transatlantic, also in the Irish Sea, into the cloud content hyperscale community. So similar to Toby's journey of 10 years, significant investment, which pretty much starts, I think, for everyone as providing services to hyperscalers, which has transformed over time to becoming a partner with hyperscalers, and then possibly a client of hyperscalers, or certainly a different dynamic to those partnerships. So those hyperscalers are very significant parts of the AquaComms business. And really, I think from our perspective, as we look at the Atlantic, we look at the growth in the US of the AI platforms, and when we see our part in that journey in Europe, it was mentioned on the previous panel that Europe is kind of next in many ways. Our viewpoint is that whilst the Googles, the Metas, the major hyperscalers are building out their own cable systems. Such is going to be the demand on networks that there will be significant traffic on the networks of other operators. And so, from our perspective, it's about building out systems to ensure availability to those customers, to those users, and subsea is a critical part of that digital infra ecosystem in partnership with my friends on the panel.
Great, many thanks. Just to note, you'll appreciate there's one face missing, Daniel, which didn't manage to make it here, but we'll try to cover all the points as well. So diving right in, let's get the pulse of the market. So probably, Toby, one for you. What is the current status that you see on the ground in terms of AI deployments? I appreciate you're covering most data centers within the FLAP-D markets, and how are you seeing the deployment on the ground, and do you see any impacts on your networks?
Thanks. Yeah, I think it was said in the last panel, really just to kind of pick up that point on the hyperscale training workloads, we're not really seeing that happening at scale in Europe yet, but there was a point around enterprise which I thought I'd kind of pick up before I get into that. And we happen to be market leaders in ultra low latency, which is a very niche part of our business, which is really supporting high frequency trading. Now, historically, we've been providing these guys with not a lot of bandwidth at a very low latency, connecting different exchange points. But actually, we note that that market sector in particular have a whole bunch of connectivity requirements up in Iceland, Norway, Finland. So the Nordic tree really is happening for certain market sectors. I think even if it's really in a very specific enterprise context who's running ahead of, say, the hyperscale deployments, I think we don't really see the hyperscale training workloads here in Europe. The main focus at the moment seems to be on deploying and overlaying AI capability on existing availability zones. And what's behind that? I think primarily inferencing. But I think there's a certain amount of pragmatism to that approach. First of all, there's proximity to the market. So there is this latency-specific characteristic of inferencing that's required. So I think that we will continue to see inferencing really following a similar kind of distribution to cloud. But I think also there's just a kind of an economic element to it, which is that by overlaying your AI workload on a cloud infrastructure, you can actually kind of dual purpose and balance some of that risk. Because I think what we're noticing is that AI demand can be pretty explosive, but it's also really unpredictable. And nobody in this market can really predict where the demand's going to come from and at scale. So actually having it on an existing environment just means that actually if you're not using it, you can sweat that asset in other ways. I think there's also just a point around time to market, which is these data centers exist today. So I think that's probably the key characteristics that we're seeing is really kind of that inferencing type build out going on.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, and I think a couple of interesting points to understand there. First, in terms of the traffic patterns that you see from that inference, obviously you've said it's incremental to the cloud. Is this like an incremental wave of demand, or is this like a step change that you've seen yet?
At the moment, it's still incremental. We're not yet seeing that kind of step change. I think cloud continues to accelerate and be a really strong driver in its own right, and but we're not kind of seeing suddenly people buying double the capacity or quadruple what they were doing before. It was already pretty steep in terms of demand growth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'll just quickly add on to that point. Actually, I mean, we noticed last year it was incremental, but it's almost getting to that point of a significant step change. We introduced, critical on our network, at least 400 gig services last year, and the adoption of those far outstripped our expectations, quite frankly. And that then introduces a significant new dynamic into subsea cable systems, the big long-haul networks. As you start moving into that realm, you then start to consider spectrum services, infrastructure sharing. These are going to be dynamics that play through over the next couple of years, outside of those major investments that are being made by the cloud.
Is that on the transatlantic?
That's on the Atlantic, yeah.
Because I guess the point is for you, you're kind of supporting that US-based training, supporting Europe, right?
Yeah, and the point was made on the last session in terms of the AI investments of the US, the attraction into the APAC markets, and the inference from a European perspective. So I think when we look at the platform, the fabric that we're building out, the fact, and everyone in this room will know about the Red Sea challenges over the last year and the impact that that's had on infrastructure, on network resilience, on network planning. These are critical things to achieve scale. They're critical things to achieve resilience for operators and users. And that resilience is critical to a most fundamental thing for everyone, which is service availability. So customers are buying the availability of a service. When we saw in the Red Sea and off the west coast of Africa last year some of the major submarine incidents, some of the cable cuts, we were quite often asked about what that meant for our industry, and we highlighted the point that it just highlights the need for more. There needs to be more systems. The hyperscalers, for example, and others will talk about availability of 5 nines. That needs 4 routes. That might be 4 entry points into a data center. It might be 4 transatlantic cable systems. This is the order of magnitude that we're going into from a scale and from a resilience perspective.
Yeah, I think adding to the points both of you were making, and certainly around the Mediterranean, one of the things that we've started seeing is not so much the sort of a step change, but building on the point about incremental demand. We're starting to see this investment in network gateways and expanding the network footprint, the network deployments. Again, Nick was making a very good point. It's 4 different routes. It's a demand around diversity. We're starting to see all of that come together. Certainly from an investment perspective, I'm not entirely sure we're seeing the tipping point yet in terms of end-use demand from consumers and enterprises, where I think we will see that will be a bow wave of demand if it materializes, when it materializes. We're not seeing that yet, but hyperscalers, GPU as a service companies, submarine cable consortiums investing ahead of that sort of expected demand, but already seeing the network footprints growing. That's something that's very tangible right now.
Absolutely. And just trying to tie in the news of the last couple of weeks, you might have seen on the news about certain announcements of a certain hyperscaler pulling back at least a few hundred megawatts of leases and LOIs. What's your take on that? You're working with those players. You're working with the market. Is this just a minor correction, or is this a change of strategy? Are we still being as bullish as we were for those deployments?
Yeah, I think for us in Europe in particular, it's a bit of a timing blip, if anything. We are seeing some of that behaviour in Europe. It's not just a US kind of facet, but as kind of noted this morning, power is such a constraint here that the ability for us to have a bubble in Europe is kind of constrained. So I think, yeah, there's a small amount of kind of timing. Really, the demand is kind of unpredictable, and people are doing their best to time their kind of investment against their revenues, and sometimes they invest too early, and sometimes they invest too late. The real challenge is making sure that that infrastructure is available when the demand turns up, and that's really tricky for everybody in this ecosystem to judge when it's just such a kind of unpredictable and volatile type environment.
Yeah, I'd add to that. I think there's always a risk that when you talk about hyperscalers that you think they're the same, and they are very, very different companies with very, very different drivers. So to give you an example from the subsea space, at around about that time that there were those Microsoft announcements, there was a Meta announcement of a very significant global subsea system called Waterworth, which is a many billions of investment. That's at a time where Meta is trying to keep in touch with and stay the same pace as Google, who are making massive global subsea investments. So I guess across the infrastructure there will be, to Toby's point, different points of slowdown based on timing. But what all of these folks at the hyperscaler and the kind of the emerging hyperscaler, and I heard, and I don't know who founded this phrase, the baby scalers, you know, this next tier of players coming through, are investing very, very heavily in their global transport platforms, their global connectivity infrastructure.
Great. So I think we've qualified the current status of deployments of where Europe is. There is a lot of inference happening, not much training, but obviously there's the plan for the future. And as Europe is catching up, or we've heard politicians speak about ambitions. We heard about the AI factory initiatives. So as Europe is catching up, what do you think the next generation of AI infrastructure will look like, and what are the associated networks are going to look like? Are they ready already to serve that demand? How should they transform for that? Maybe one for you, Aditya, maybe to start with.
Sure. Let me see if I can break this up into 3 or 4 component parts. Europe, so far, certainly in terms of what, for example, we've heard on the previous panels, I don't think we've seen that training-driven set of deployments as much in Europe as has happened over in the States and as has happened in APAC. That said, with all the news that's been around saying scaling laws are dead, we've used up all the data on the internet, etc., etc. There's almost a shift in the architecture of how these LLMs are being trained, and that's driving towards distributed training. We're starting to see the first glimmers of that. To put this into context, it's almost sort of an efficiency versus effectiveness sort of paradigm. LLMs are great at making us more efficient. So Professor Eric Brynjolfsson at MIT put out a fairly recent study which basically said in call centers, the use of AI basically makes the most recently hired human agent almost as productive as some of the most experienced agents, right? So it sort of levels the playing field. But then when you start combining that with quantitative models, you end up at the Google DeepMind end of the spectrum, where you're now starting to combine these quantitative models. You have this multi-step chain of thought reasoning, etc., etc. That requires a lot of synthetic data. That requires a lot of verifiable data, the modeling of the laws of physics, so on and so forth. And that lends itself very well to distributed training rather than having these centralized supercomputing clusters. It's quite reasonable to assume that the distributed training will migrate to locations like the Middle East, where the cost of power is very low. But that still requires a centrality of Europe to transmit all of that data, to exchange all of that data. So there are distributed training workloads that will to some extent residing in Europe because of data sovereignty concerns. That data will transit via Europe because Europe is digitally and geographically still central to the world's interconnectivity architecture. And then, of course, you have inference, and we'll talk about inference later, but inference, by definition, needs to be closer to where the population centers are, where the end users, and inference is where anything related to AI ultimately generates returns. That's where people will make money. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think to that part, there's also the geopolitical angle as well. Obviously, the world is rapidly shifting, and a lot of the training has been happening in the USA. Now, obviously, in a more, let's say, distributed world, would you see that also as a driver in Europe? Would you see Europe wanting to have its own strategy and pursue that?
I think data sovereignty has been a pretty strong tailwind for us as a business. Even when you look at somebody like ByteDance, TikTok, they've entered Europe purely because of GDPR. So it's a kind of a standout, but actually we see that even in a very kind of country-specific context. Germany has its own data sovereignty laws, which is retaining a lot of data within Germany specifically, and all of that kind of fragments the landscape. So it certainly is a kind of another driver for a distributed kind of environment for compute across Europe. I mean, for me, the number one trend and story looking in the future is just going to be power. And I think the supply side just cannot keep up with the demand side in Europe. Planning in particular is a multi-year complex process, which is just always going to mean that you just can't get the power where it needs to be in time. So I think mostly that's transmission. There's also a kind of a generation story behind that, which will come to play. But for me, really is kind of playing out in terms of kind of distributing data centers around Europe. And we're seeing three kind of prongs or trends coming out of that. At the local level, established tier one markets like London and Frankfurt, we are being asked to build longer, more latency optimized routes to extend our existing metros to data centers, which can find new packets of land and power and connect those back. So we're seeing the expansion of those tier one markets organically. Then likewise, we're seeing other cities within major economies in Europe starting to pick up that workload. So Düsseldorf, Berlin, Leeds, Newport. There's that expansion or establishment of new zones within existing kind of operated countries. And then lastly is this point around building out more and more availability zones in new countries. I think people have talked about flat D for a long time, but for us, I suppose Dublin is quite constrained, and we anticipate and we can see quite a lot of demand growth in Italy and Spain. So, whether that's going to be kind of transition to a kind of a more of a FLAMP type model where you've got Milan, Madrid in there, I think that's kind of be more reflective, I suppose, of the way that the European economy is set up. So, for me, that's going to be core for us, but it's beyond that. I think every country is picking up the workload because that's where the power is. You've got to pick it up.
Yeah, I guess just 2 points into that. I mean, the question of power and timing and looking at things through a lens of 4 or 5 years is very much the subsea industry as well. So, if we think more globally, the big Trans-Pacific cable systems that have been announced several years ago will be delivered next year rather than last year. There's 3 systems on the Pacific that spring to mind. In the Atlantic, if there is a plan to think about building a cable system today, it won't be live and operational until 2029. So there's a very close parallel here. So I think it's critical to have that that mindset of kind of joint planning across the infrastructure. Just back to the original point on geopolitics, and I think this feeds into that as well. Obviously this year has raised a whole range of new and interesting aspects of geopolitics. But if we look back on last year, for our space, for our sector, for AI, the Middle East and the challenges of the Middle East and the challenges of the Red Sea were absolutely crucial to the play out, the investment, the creation of this kind of AI corridor between the Middle East and the US that we see. And as we're sat here in Athens and we look at the role that Greece has got to play, it's fascinating, it's extraordinary, and DTA can speak to it better than I can. But when we think about those subsea builds, those investments, the timeline for that, the interplay with terrestrial network as well, and how you kind of create that diversity and resilience through subsea and terrestrial systems, again, Middle East being a good example of that, and through South and Eastern Europe. Geopolitics shapes what happens next for us.
Absolutely. It gives a great segue to discuss more about the local angle and maybe about the geographical importance of those network elements. So we mentioned Greece being potentially an important player there. Aditya, you have been thinking about that, acting on that. What do you think?
Yeah, I think the whole geopolitical angle, the drive towards data sovereignty, as you were saying, Toby, it's been a huge tailwind, of course. We see this as a coming together of a couple of things. At the end of the day, wherever these models are being created, whether they're Chinese, whether they're American, at the end of the day, they need to find global usage. They need to find enterprise uptake. They need to find end consumer uptake. There is a particular implication on network architectures. I mean, if you think about it, FLAP-D, FLAMP, whatever is the latest mangled acronym, those metros exchange about a third of the world's internet traffic, right? And it passes through Europe, but isn't necessarily destined for Europe, right? So this is North American, Asian, African traffic tromboning through Europe, primarily being transported over submarine cables, right? So that's one element to bear in mind. The second element then to bear in mind is, at the end of the day, where you choose to host these network nodes and these AI clusters not only has an implication or a compliance with data sovereignty requirements, there is, especially given the last couple of weeks, months we've seen of policy changes, there's a certain regulatory stability that Europe offers, that the EU offers. There is still a huge amount of demand for that. I mean, if you think of, for example, the Chinese hyperscalers or some of the Chinese AI creators, they are very much in search of global audiences as well. They want to serve Africa, they want to serve Western Asia or the Middle East. Where better to find a regulatorily stable environment to serve these sorts of audiences, but in Europe, and certainly in the Mediterranean, in southern Europe. Latency definitely is one of the larger drivers. There are a couple of other implications, especially when you come to inference. To put this into context, if you're serving up content to audiences, you are happy with a 10 millisecond sort of latency. With AI, the implication is slightly different, with inference, that is. You go from serving one movie file on Netflix, to 6 million people in the Athens metro area, through multicast, right? So content caching, we all watch that movie or whatever that's released on Netflix. It's essentially the same media file that's served out to us through multicast. With multimodal inference, it's 6 million audio files or video files based on whatever prompts each of us put in individually. And that's a huge implication in terms of network traffic, right? So inference is going to create that gravity in different locations, like Athens, for example, like Chania, like Genoa, closer to Milan, so on and so forth. But then distributed training requires fat pipes to connect up these distributed clusters that talk to whatever is the parent cluster in China or in the US. So again, you need fat pipes. So you need fat pipes, data pipes, connecting these locations. You need the capillarity of distribution networks, and I think European metros are phenomenally placed to serve this role globally. So that's the sort of development we're seeing. We're seeing hyperscalers invest in these network gateways in these locations. We're seeing GPU as a service companies investing in subsea cable infrastructure, and building finally on the point Nick was making. The first wave of the internet started seeing 10G. So when, way back in the day when Google or Yahoo connected their first crop of servers to the internet to serve global audiences, they were talking of 10G connections. That moved to several hundred Gs and 400 Gs with cloud DC to DC connectivity, right? We're starting to see the first 1 terabit per second investments over and above whatever are the outright fiber pair or cable investments we're seeing from hyperscalers. But we're starting to anecdotally see the first 1 Tbps circuit sales. This requires the building out of the connectivity infrastructure that will then serve these availability zones, that will serve these cluster deployments. So I'll stop there and I'll slow back to you.
I'll jump in actually on two parts to that, two sides to that. So you mentioned 10 gigs. I think it was 1998 that I sold 155 meg service, which was about the fattest pipe you could provide then for about $10 million. That just shows how old I am. But then to your point in terms of terabit services, terabit wavelength services, we trialled and achieved a new milestone on the Atlantic last year of a 1.3 terabit transmission, which paves our way to offering 800 gig services, for example, and we kind of follow the lead of some of the terrestrial folks and some of the IP nodes and peering points as to what the demand for that will be. But we are building it into our network, and I think whilst you need fibre for scale and you need multiple paths for diversity, you also need to be innovative with what you have. Technological change that's supporting that is at a pace, and I think you need to be prepared to adopt that. Certainly we are on the Atlantic, and maybe if we sit here in a year's time, we'll be talking about 800 gig wavelengths as a standard service, which will be quite a difference from 26 years ago selling 155 megs.
That's great to hear, because just a few moments ago we were speaking about the barriers to the AI proliferation. We've spoken about the power being the main one. Obviously connectivity is an important dimension, but from what you're saying, it feels like connectivity is ready to innovate. The products are being developed, so connectivity will be there and will be ready to support the next wave.
It's there in terms of if you're willing to innovate and to be agile and to do that, then you have capability. So an example, we think about telecoms and the delivery of a 10 gig service or a 100 gig service, and maybe that takes 2 weeks or 2 months depending on which operator is providing it. We've spoken to West Coast clients that will ask if they can buy a 400 gig service on an app. Can we buy this off my phone and can we have it delivered tomorrow? We can't do it today, but we might be able to do it next year. And that then is a huge enabler and a quantum shift for us in terms of optical networking and the services that we provide on the infrastructure to support the massive data center growth.
Yeah, I think for me, there is some innovation required. In telecoms, we have a scaling challenge that is slowly getting closer around the Shannon limit, which is how much bandwidth can you get out of a fibre pair. And every year we come out and we squeeze a bit more out of that fibre. But for the last 2 decades, the story has really been that actually the technology can get enough bandwidth out of that fibre that actually the demand for fibre has been quite suppressed, in the long haul in particular. And I think we're starting to see that dynamic is changing. So whereas before you just upgrade your hardware and get more bandwidth, now we can see the tipping point in terms of fibre demand in the long haul, which is really kind of driving us on an investment rationale around overbuilding what we call superhighways, which are brand new long haul routes between our core metros. So up until now, we've, as a market, pretty much been living off the assets built during the dot-com boom 25 years ago, and those assets are getting exhausted, unreliable, and actually less than optimal performance. And so we're going to be the first company next year to complete a contiguous flap figure of 8, really to meet that demand on what we see really is the core of the European connectivity market. So that'll really enable much higher scaling for that core in terms of kind of fibre pairs and being able to ramp up that demand. I think the other kind of technology that we're seeing emerging is hollow core fibre. We've been deploying that really in metros and in a small extent long haul to reduce latency for trading. But there's a huge amount of interest, I think, in the data center space in terms of effectively bringing data centers closer together because of the latency characteristics. So, that's something that we'll continue to work on and lead the market on.
Yeah,
I think just to add one very quick final point. I think technology will innovate, it will progress. I don't necessarily see technology as the bottleneck. I think the challenges are more commercial, and it's more around how we develop ecosystems and diversity. I mean, to give you an example, Marseille today is a single point of failure. It's phenomenally successful, but with 18 plus now going up to some 25, 26 commuted cables landing in Marseille, with the extremely poor quality of terrestrial networks coming out of Marseille and availability. If we're going to see AI architectures evolve, then how we develop connectivity ecosystems, diversity internal connectivity, and alternate peering locations, that needs to move. And that's more of a commercial and ecosystem question. I don't think technology is the limiting factor there.
Yeah, I think investment is, so to Toby's point in terms of the terrestrial superhighway, AquaComms is focused on connecting continents. I guess just as a closing comment of, the build out of new AI facilities in Europe, proximity to connectivity is the crucial thing. Nordics is a hot topic, clearly very, very attractive region. There is one transatlantic subsea cable system that goes into the Nordics. We built it, we operate it. So there needs to be significant investment if you are going to see these new regions truly flourish and be supported by the critical need of connectivity.
All right, sounds like a lot of exciting developments. I think we were almost out of time, actually, fully out of time. So unless there's any burning question, which panelists could take also offline, we can conclude here. And thanks a lot, everyone, for your attention.